Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating intersection: corporate accountability and human rights. We're going to explore exactly how the forestry industry quantifies its social impact. Because, it's one thing for a company to simply say they respect human rights, but how do they actually measure it? How do they prove it to local communities? Well, we'll be using the SASB Forestry Management Standard to break down the exact data points they are required to report. It's a tough question, isn't it? I mean, how do you actually measure respect? How do you take these incredibly complex, totally intangible concepts like Indigenous sovereignty or community well-being and somehow translate them into hard, comparable corporate data? Investors and the public just aren't satisfied with vague promises anymore. They want proof. So let's see how this framework actually attempts to provide it. Now, before we get totally lost in the technical weeds, we really need to ground ourselves in the reality of what's at stake here. The SASB standard puts it perfectly, stating forests contribute directly to the livelihoods of millions of people worldwide. We aren't just talking about trees and timber yields today. The decisions being made in corporate boardrooms have a direct, literal daily impact on millions of lives. Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll start with the human side of forestry, then break down metric 1 for measuring indigenous land, look at metric 2 for tracking due diligence, see how they align with global standards, and finally, look at protecting community interests. Let's jump right in. First up, the human side of forestry, and really understanding the stakes. So when a forestry company moves into an area, they absolutely aren't operating in a vacuum. Environmental degradation or intense competition for natural resources, like land and water, can create severe operational risks. It can cause major conflict with local communities, especially indigenous populations. If a company mismanages these relationships, it can lead to regulatory action, halted operations, and just massive damage to their brand value. On the flip side, good management brings employment and shared revenue. Notice how SASB categorizes this challenge under the rights of indigenous peoples. They use two very specific metrics to measure how a company mitigates these risks, labeled RR-FM-210a.1 and RR-FM-210a.2. One gives us a hard quantitative number, and the other gives us a detailed qualitative narrative. Together, they give us the whole shebang, a complete picture of a company's social footprint. Okay, moving on to metric 1, measuring indigenous land. Think of this as the quantitative map. Let's start with the hard numbers. Metric 210a.1 requires companies to calculate and disclose the exact geographic footprint of their operations that overlap with indigenous territories. They literally have to put a specific number of hectares on the table. But how do we actually define indigenous lands in a corporate report? Well, the standard doesn't really leave room for interpretation here. It relies on strict international frameworks like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and ILO Convention 169. We're talking about lands occupied by people who self-identify as indigenous. These are people with historical continuity to pre-colonial societies, totally distinct cultures and languages, and a firm resolve to maintain their ancestral environments. Relying on these global definitions is a game changer because it prevents companies from finding convenient loopholes in local zoning laws. So what exactly is the company accountable for counting? They don't just count the land they actually hold the deed to. The scope here is incredibly broad. A company has to disclose the total hectares across owned forest lands, leased forest lands, and managed forest lands. It's really interesting because a company cannot simply outsource its accountability. Even if they're just managing the land on behalf of someone else, if that land is in an indigenous area, it goes straight into their total hectare count. The data has to accurately reflect their entire operational reality, no matter what the legal structure of the land contract looks like. That brings us to metric 2, tracking due diligence. This is our qualitative compass. If metric 1 tells us the where, then metric 2 or 210a.2 is all about the how. It requires a narrative description of their due diligence practices regarding human rights and local communities. It's the story behind those hectare numbers. To ensure compliance, companies have to employ a life cycle of due diligence, which you can see mapped out here. It generally starts with deep impact evaluations and assessment reports. The goal is to identify risks before a single tree is ever felled, but it absolutely doesn't stop once operations begin. The standard expects ongoing monitoring and regular audits, alongside formal public inquiry processes. This means having real, active mechanisms in place to receive public grievances, host community meetings, and essentially maintain a continuous, two-way street of communication throughout the entire lifetime of a logging project. Next up, Section 4, aligning with global standards and mapping the frameworks. Now, these due diligence procedures we just looked at, a company can't just make them up in a vacuum.
To be credible, they explicitly have to map their practices against recognized, rigorous global frameworks. Let's break down this matrix. First, companies must describe how they uphold the ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. This means they have to prove they have strict protections against forced and child labor, and they're ensuring fair wages and freedom of association. They also have to map their due diligence to the UN guiding principles on business and human rights and align with the voluntary principles on security and human rights. What this does is create this dense, inescapable web of global accountability. Their local operations must adhere to it, regardless of where they are operating in the world.
And finally, Section 5, Protecting Community Interests. This takes us way beyond just the trees. Because true due diligence extends way beyond just checking a basic legal compliance box. The metrics require companies to report on their active protection of a community's holistic interests. It's acknowledging that a forest is often the foundation of a community's entire way of life. So companies have to detail their practices across 4 specific pillars. First, economic rights. Are they actually providing local employment, training, and fair wages? Second, environmental rights. Are they ensuring clean local air and water and safely disposing of waste? Third, social rights. Are they respecting the community's right to adequate healthcare, education, and housing? And finally, cultural rights. This one is absolutely vital. Companies must report on exactly how they protect places of cultural significance, like sacred or burial sites. And here is where the standard shows its real teeth. We can think of it as a ripple effect. The standard explicitly states that these human rights practices and social covenants have to apply to business partners. That means contractors, subcontractors, suppliers, and joint arrangement partners. A forestry management entity cannot just turn a blind eye and say, well, hey, our subcontractor violated those cultural rights, not us. No way. The core entity is totally responsible for ensuring these protections cascade down their entire supply chain. If a partner is operating on the land, they are bound by the exact same social and ethical expectations as the parent company. So I want to leave you with a final thought to reflect on. How will this level of transparency change the future of the forestry industry? By requiring this rigorous blend of hard, quantitative data on land use, like the exact hectares we talked about, alongside deeply detailed qualitative narratives on human rights enforcement across the entire supply chain, frameworks like SASB are completely reshaping corporate accountability. It forces a reality where respecting Indigenous and community rights isn't just good PR anymore. It's measurable, mandatory business data. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to keep questioning the data behind the decisions.